Bibliosophie.
Hello, welcome to my channel. My name is Sophie. I like to talk about books. Why do I like to talk about books? Partially because I love to read, but I've been thinking a lot about what is reading. So this isn't going to be a proper video essay. It's rather going to be some ruminations, some thoughts. I would call it a conversation, but it's going to be a pretty one-sided conversation because I'm just essentially monologizing to my phone. What is reading? It's a very peculiar sort of phenomenon, right? And it opens up all of these questions that get kind of controversial about the right type of reading, the right way to read, and even if something is reading. I've been thinking about this a lot because of my own writing. I am a musician and I'm also an academic. I'm writing a dissertation and it's not specifically about reading, but it's not about reading. So these are thoughts that are mushing about in my brain a lot. I've also been thinking about this because I have been threatening, promising to make a video about how I read for a little while, and I still haven't made it. And one of the things standing in my way is partially thinking about how I read for different things. So how I read led me to why I read, which led me to, well, what actually even is reading? And those questions are just so thoroughly knotted up together. Controversial question is, are audiobooks books? Is listening to an audiobook reading? This is something that occurs in various videos, and especially in my opinion, or experience rather, in the comment sections of videos. And my answer is yes. Audiobooks are books, and listening to an audiobook, consuming an audiobook is reading that book. And to say anything else than basically a yes is ableist, quite frankly. However, it would be silly to say that listening to an audiobook is exactly the same as reading a book in print. Reading a book in print is not the same even as reading a book on a screen. Listening to somebody in the room recite to you parts of a book is not the same as listening to an audiobook, is not the same as reading in your head, as not the same as reading aloud. I'm not trying to say that they're all the same types of reading. They are all reading in some way. Okay, so what is reading? Is it merely consuming information? Have I read a book officially if I can give you the salient points of it? That's an answer, but I think that's a middling answer in a lot of cases. I think that's an unsatisfying answer, not just an unsatisfactory one, but really an unsatisfying answer. Sure, you are reading a diagram or you are reading an instruction manual. The point of reading it is to get the information, probably. You're reading a novel, could be that the point is to get the plot. That's kind of the information. But it's also to get lost in a world. It's to have a relationship to the text. You're reading poetry, you might have plot, you might not. Was there no point to reading it if you can't give back the facts? Of course not. There was plenty of point. You had an experience. So there is a whole set of phenomena around reading that we can't discount. There is a multisensory experience to reading, which is partially also why an audiobook is also a book, because even if we tend to think in a literate society that reading means using our eyes, which have vision, to understand a set of signifiers on a page, and from there extrapolate the meanings of words and put them all together and concoct a scene or learn some information. That's not exclusively what we actually read. I mentioned I'm a musician. I read music. There are no words involved. It's very similar in many ways. You have to learn a specific kind of language, a whole set of symbols and signifiers that are supposed to turn a flat series of blobs into something else. But it's not the same as reading. I read a lot for academic purposes. I read a lot for pleasure. Are those readings different? Absolutely. And then sometimes not, because I have chosen to pursue an academic path that is very well aligned with my personal obsessions. And my personal obsessions are relatively highfalutin and academic. But we also read a situation, we read a room, we read somebody's emotions. That's obviously not the same use of the word reading, but it is reading. It is being given information and judging it, perceiving it, translating it. We're going to get back to translating, trying to integrate it. Reading is an act of transmutation. And that's part of what makes it so finicky and blurry and multifaceted, because we are always mutating different senses together. Can you taste the food in a banquet scene of a fantasy novel? You might not, some people might. Do you even see what's going on in a fictional scene? Again, some people are able to do that, and some people are actually not able to at all. And then a lot of us are just kind of in between, and it's on a case-by-case basis. Do you picture a scene in a history book? Again, we go back to the instruction manual. Is your method of figuring out what is going on to then map it out visually for yourself in your head, or even to draw it? There are so many different branching ways in which we can understand reading. And then it goes hand in hand with decisions about not just what is reading, but what we should be reading, how we should be reading, what is the right way to read. And that gets extremely thorny. What is the right way to read, and what are the right types of things to read? We are constantly obsessed with that. And unfortunately, there's not an easy answer. I do believe that certain things are better than others in many, many ways. And in fact, I'm very much of the mindset that reading is not some sort of moral act. I love to read. I think that reading is important. I encourage people to read. I think that people who read are interesting, yada, yada, yada. It is not the only way to be interesting. And again, as I just mentioned, reading a book is not the only way to read. I would much rather have a conversation with somebody who has a very, very integrated, interesting, and active relationship to nature, to other forms of art, to conversation, to any number of subjects. That person is in many ways reading the world around them, than somebody who is reading a bajillion books that don't interest me. There is not this ultimate moral and intellectual good just because it's a book. Most books are pretty bad, actually, and sometimes that's a neutral bad. Again, that's a huge judgment. Some books are bad. Well, what makes them bad? Is it because they are completely banal? Yeah, I think there are a lot of super banal books. I think there are dangerous books also. And I don't mean the types of books that typically get banned, of course. I think books that are dangerous are usually the ones that get canonized, that are read without really enough critical thought. I think some of those dangerous books should be read, but how we read them, what we actually read in them, into them, matters tremendously. So I read a classic piece of English literature. I'm being told a series of things, and it behooves me to read on a bunch of different levels and not just swallow the agenda of the book. So, does reading always have to be constantly active in order to be worthy? Maybe, maybe not. I think this also kind of circles back to our audiobook vilification. You're not reading because you're passively getting stuff. Well, that's not true. We use our brains a lot when we listen to things. Different people process different information differently. So that absolutely does not track. Thank you very much. But also, can you be considered to have read something if you didn't annotate it to death? If you can't perfectly regurgitate every element? No, absolutely not. Okay, regurgitation is not active enough. You need to be able to translate it into your own words. You need to paraphrase and get larger themes. You need to have dived into the text. That's glorious and wonderful and worthy, but I don't think we always have to hold ourselves to that level of reading. I do a lot of that kind of reading. I do extremely obsessive analyzing and reading. I write about it, in fact, on my Substack, in my dissertation, in my journal. I talk the heads off of my loved ones about what I read into the specific sound of a specific word in a specific place. I don't think that everybody should be doing that to everything. Not everything deserves, wants that kind of close reading. So how much activity am I supposed to give to reading for it to be officially reading? And what is that activity? Because fundamentally, am I a vessel who is accepting the words of an author? Or am I playing with the author? I have increasingly over the years, or potentially always naturally, been of a mind that the act of reading is an act of interpretation, is an act of co-authorship. That's also very much what I write about. I have Barthes very much in part to thank for this sort of thought process. He argues that to read is to also want to write. It is an act of taking the text and transforming it. And I absolutely feel that. But I don't feel that always. I don't feel it constantly and actively, because sometimes I do feel like I want to read in order to lose myself. The pandemic saw a lot of people reading more because they had more time, but I think also because they wanted to just get lost in a world. That was my case. I started reading more than I ever had again or before, and I also started becoming extremely depressed, and because of that, I just started chewing up books like crazy. I don't think I was really looking to co-author those texts for a long time. I think I was looking to be a bit of a vessel. I was looking to lose myself. And then I started looking to find myself, find my own voice. I kind of stopped having even a coherent say in whether I wanted to look for myself or not. I just sort of started finding myself in things. But not every text is going to have exactly the same thing. So am I just circling around the answer of, well, it depends? Yeah. Fundamentally, if you want the extremely short form summary, yes, absolutely. It depends. What's the point? What's the point of ruminating? Well, because I think people want really clear metrics, and it shows up in what is a book? How much of the book do you have to have read in order to say that you read it? Again, that shouldn't necessarily matter, but it matters on YouTube. It matters in your Goodreads stats. It matters for your ego. I list the books that I've finished. I don't list all the books that I've read something like 10 pages of. I did read part of the book. Do I feel like I have had a deep investment in absolutely every single letter of every book that I say that I've finished? Absolutely not. Do I skip pages? Basically, sometimes. The example that I've given before is that I read War and Peace a while ago. I really liked War and Peace. I'm due for a reread because it's been a good number of years. I barely read all of the war scenes. I would say that I did not read those, essentially. I would read, a few words here and there, kind of, but there are probably about 100 pages of that very long book that I have just not read. Do I get to say that I read the book? I say that I read the book. You can say that I didn't. That's okay. I think I had a very strong and intellectual, emotional relationship to the majority of that book. And I think that not knowing the ins and outs of the various battle scenes doesn't mean that I didn't read the book. However, I would probably not lecture on how battle scenes are written in War and Peace. If I started becoming a scholar on that, I would say probably I should not consider that I read the book, at least not for that purpose. And I think that's also part of the reason for wanting to have a very definitive, did you do it right? It feels unfair when people misconstrue a book. It is unfair. And so you wonder, did you read it correctly? Do you know what you're talking about? Because it's very, very obvious that we, as a species, misread constantly. We misread and we misremember. And a lot of us are also just not taught to properly analyze a situation, whether it's literary or not. So, yeah, I get upset too. I get really, really upset when people say that, I've read that book. And they, maybe technically they read that book, I guess. They might have read every page, every moment of every page. But I want to tell them, you did not read that book. You did not understand that book. If it didn't change you in the way that I think it should have changed you, you didn't read that book. Why do I get to make that call? Of course, I don't. But I still feel like I want to make that call. Metrics are so important for that reason. Because all of this is so nebulous, we want to have at least some sense of what is true and just and right and wrong. And of course, we can use good sense and goodwill, but not everybody has the same good sense. I'm not even going to say that not everybody has good sense. We don't have the same good sense. And I think some of us just don't have good sense. And some of us certainly don't have goodwill. So you want to get the receipts. You want to prove, no, actually, I can argue this fact because these are the authors that I have read. Yes, no, I really did read them. But there's always going to be an asterisk somewhere, unfortunately. And fortunately, it's this never-ending tunnel, let's say. I was seeking out a metaphor. I mentioned War and Peace. Another thing that needs to be noted is that I did not read it in Russian. I told you I would mention translation again. Do you get to say that you read a specific thing if you didn't read it in the language? And that gets so thorny as well. Does it depend on the book? Does a novel not need to be in its original language because it's more about plot? So if you know what the events of the novel are, then you read it. Well, no, because so many of those novels are about the language, the stuff. Translation is such an important thing to me. I read almost exclusively in French and in English, but I have read in other languages as well. And yeah, I do think that you are missing an element of something if you don't read it in the original language. But we can argue also that in not reading it in the translated version, you are also missing something. Maybe it's not worthy because we tend to think that the original is the best. But if we think of the act of reading and the act of interpreting and the act of thinking about as pieces of co-authorship, certainly translation is a continuation of that process. So the act of translation is making something new as well. And sometimes translated works are absolutely extraordinary. Every so often, they make the original more interesting as well. There is not necessarily inherently a primariness, a moral primariness to the original, even though we tend to think of it that way. So there are so many complicating factors. I don't have any answers for you. This was mostly a ruminating event for me, as I mentioned. If I have a takeaway, because I do try to have the slightest bit of takeaway, if I'm going to just make a soliloquy for about 20 plus minutes, ideally I can leave you with something. It is to embrace this multiplicity. I find it sad to limit ourselves. There are many things I don't want to read. There are many ways in which I don't want to read them. That's going to be the case for all of us. However, it is constraining to think of only one type of reading as proper reading. It is constraining to think of only one type of writing as writing that is meant to be read. And I don't just mean that, read quickly the kind of slushy pulp novels that don't need to be dug into. Maybe you don't have it in you to dig into all of the metaphorical connections of a poem. I have said this before on this channel. Just let the sound play wash over you. Maybe you don't get a book that is deeply philosophical and important and canonical. That's okay. Read it badly. Maybe it has a use to you. Maybe you learn a word. Maybe you are learning a new language and you are reading sentences truly to literally get this word and then that word and then that word. You're not doing the same type of reading as when you're reading in a language that you know really well. Allow yourself to have different levels of reading, different purposes to your reading, different sensory expectations to different types of writing, different types of media, and allow yourself to reread, read into, and sift through all of this information, passively, actively, and somewhere in between. And with that, I leave you. Bye-bye.